The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus entered the synagogue. There was a man there who had a withered hand. They watched Jesus closely to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. He said to the man with the withered hand, Come up here before us." Then he said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil? To destroy rather, to save life rather than to destroy it?" They remained silent, looking around at them with anger, grieved by their hardness of heart. Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately took counsel with the Herodians against Jesus to put him to death. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. I want to thank you for coming early today and avoiding the 8:15 rush. I mentioned this, a week or so ago. I do hope you're praying, or just I'll ask you again, in a spirit of, what would you call it? I'll just say devotion, faith, to pray that more people are motivated to come to the daily Mass. That could be a homily in itself, but I just think it's a wisdom, it's a call. As I've said, the morning Mass, I think, is a very important part of the identity, but the faith of the parish. You're coming daily. You're nourished with the Word and the sacrament, and you bring it out into the community here at Madison Heights, and however far you reach, your impact reaches. It is something of an indication of the health of a parish, so without making a big deal, just pray and ask the Lord to send us those who coulda, woulda, shoulda, oughta be coming. For those who can't manage the cold, thank you for being wise enough to stay home. I don't recall ever doing it before, although they may have been one or two times in 40 years, but I chose to do the votive Mass today for times of war and civil, times of war and civil disturbance. I didn't look at the ordo directly this morning to see what the order was offering or suggesting for us, but I think it's a pertinent Mass to pray, the collective prayers. This is a time of war in the world, and the world is small enough now that we can, thank God it's over there and it's not us. Well, the reality is it is us. War is never good. It's always disparaging, and there's always ravages of war, particularly in these modern times. But there's also the kind of war, the inner war, the wars that go on inside ourselves and leave us ill at peace, because it's the inner wars that create the outer wars. I've always thought, and again, I don't have a rich or broad enough understanding of the Old Testament theologies. Obviously, David and Samuel, this is from the book of Samuel still, but David is righteous before God. Sinful and disordered as he's had times in his life, he loves God, he is humble before God, and he owns and admits his sins, and he confesses. It's curious why he had to not only kill the Philistine, but then lop off his head. Okay, maybe a minor point, but not to the Philistine. So just think about that. The message in the first reading is pretty obvious, but because they're obvious, say, okay, well, we know that. But think about it. It doesn't say it, but I think it's clear. I didn't read the previous verses, but I think it's clear that if Saul is there, kind of on the rim of the battlefield, if Saul is there, Saul's army is there with him. So look at the larger picture. Saul the king is there. He's got the king's army with him, and you get this little runt of a kid, 18, maybe 20 years old, well, maybe 25, I don't know how old he was, maybe he was 16, probably not. And this little runt of a kid, ruddy and handsome to behold, said, oh, don't worry about it, Saul, I'll take care of this. Oh, no, you can't, you're just little. But he does. Given the temperament and personality of Saul, you can see why Saul became very jealous and very hard-hearted, mean, threatening to David. Again, that inner warring that was in Saul. Saul moved away from God because he became a very successful king in many quadrants of his administration and leadership of peoples. And he thought it was by his own wisdom and his own charisms that he was doing all this, when in fact it was the gift of God. David, sinful as he was at times, was dependent on God. And this is a very good example of that. That he seems completely unafraid. Hey, I've killed bigger bears than this guy, lions and everything else. I'll go take care of this problem for you, Saul. But he knows, because he proclaims it, I come against you not with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord. He trusts in God. And he's a pretty good shot, too. Amazing. Not only try to understand, but to stand under what's going on. Look at the courage of this young man, the zeal. Maybe it is because of his age. Younger men tend to be more zealous and courageous. Older men kind of are wearied by life and say, well, that's never going to happen for me. But David believed in God. He trusted. And when he had inner divisions, he spoke to the Lord about them. Nehemiah, his spiritual director, the prophet, he would talk with Nehemiah, and that's not really the will of the Lord. And you've offended God. And so David repented, and God forgave. Look at the inner warring going on in the gospel. Clearly, these Pharisees, they're good and righteous. They are. They love God in the way they love God. But they love God in light only of their own power and control. It is clear, and it is true, even obvious, that Jesus was a great disruption to the social and spiritual religious order of his time, and even in our time. That's why people don't like Jesus. They think they like him, and they think they want to believe in him, but in his own way, he was quite radical. And he needed to be. Because God's ways are not our ways, and our ways are not God's ways. Jesus revealed and lived the ways of God. These Pharisees and Herodians, particularly the Pharisees, teachers of the law, they had a lot to lose. But in some ways, it was their zeal for God through the law that they were concerned, and they wanted to trap Jesus and get rid of him, because he was breaking down the social religious fabric of the culture. But Jesus is truth. There's no way around it. Jesus is truth. He's compassion. He's mercy. He's wisdom. So he says to the guy with the withered hand, come on up here. And then he says to the Pharisees, he speaks a truth of God. And they don't get it. Or they do get it, and in a rare moment of wisdom, they don't say anything. Is it lawful, or is it in the will of God to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath, or any other day for that matter? They remain silent because they know he's right. It seems uncharacteristic, but I think it's quite apropos. Seems uncharacteristic that Jesus would be angry. A righteous anger, don't you think? But now we know what makes Jesus angry. I don't believe there's anywhere in any of the Gospels where Jesus gets angry at the sins of morality. Not that they're, not important. They are. He gets angry and he's grieved at their hardness of heart because they're having an inner war in themselves and they don't know it because they're at the top of the hill. They've got the power and the control, they've got the wealth, and they have it in the name of God, self-made, so they don't feel the tension. But they're looking the very God they say they believe in the face. They don't know he's God, not through their own fault, but they don't know yet that he is the divine God, living in Messiah to be. And so they live with the division they don't know. Now, if this was a Sunday, this could be a 35-minute homily. Look at the divisions in our culture. Okay, that hot topic, politics. Look at the inner divisions that people on one side or the other cannot or will not even interact. That comes from the warring inside each person. And it's causing great destruction, great chaos, disorder. Not only here, but it could destabilize the whole world. That's a fact. It was St. John Paul, I think pretty early in his papacy, and he said, how did that go? Boards of directors don't make unjust policies. Individuals do. And that's true. So if there's one or two people on a board or on a committee or in a political system who believe in something, whether it's right or wrong, they can bind up the whole thing. And then we can accuse the system for not working the way we want. But the reality is, at the end of the day, it's individuals. So for that reason, I think it's good to say this votive Mass in times of war and civil disruption. It matters if the inside of ourselves and the outside match. If we say we believe in Jesus, and we do, then our lives should reflect that. I mentioned yesterday, and it's appropriate again today, it's not friendly because we don't like it, but the reality is life is filled with contradictions. And what's the other word I'm trying to think of? Contradictions. There's always going to be light and darkness. There's always going to be sin and grace, etc. God knows that. Jesus himself is that contradiction. The incarnation of the triune God, light and fullness, truth and wisdom, who himself becomes sin, so that he who takes on all our sins becomes the Redeemer. We have to live with the fact that the world's never going to be perfect. We have to live with the fact that when we look in the mirror, we're never going to be perfect. Perfection doesn't mean math and science, edge to edge, corner and corner. It's got to be exactly right. Perfection means wholeness, persevering to the end. Jesus was so disruptive to social, spiritual society, religious society, they killed him. But he persevered to the end. He was perfect. He was whole in the will of God. There was no division in him. Think about it. Pray for the church. Pray for the world. Pray for those who are in the trauma of war. Pray for politicians. Pray for democracy. But don't pray your will, please. Pray God's will, because our will and our way is not the same as God's. Thank God for that.